listen to a history lecture. So I decided I would sneak something in. I would call it amateur radio in the 1950s and before. But I'm going to go back and start all the way back. If you put that, those back up. You probably recognize those. Those are the Maxwell equations. In the late 70s and early 1700s and early 1800s, a lot of people were doing research with magnets and electric fields and stuff like that. And they worked out all the equations. People named Ampere and Volta and Gauss and Ohm and people like that worked out these equations. And about in the, let's see, I've got a date here, about 1860s, I'm sorry, a British physicist named James Clerk Maxwell started looking at these equations and found out that they kind of fit together. They mesh. But to do that, you get into some fancy integral or differential equations, and I never even took calculus. I have no idea how to solve these things.
Come on, Gary.
But this little constant called C kept popping up in there. And let's go to the next one, ham O2. Those can be condensed down into a little bit simpler form. And that little figure C keeps popping up again. I bolded it in those rather than circling it.
Oh, okay.
I cannot solve these equations, but I can tell you what they mean, and you know the answer. They mean a changing electric field induces a magnetic field, and a changing magnetic field induces an electric field, and a changing electric field induces a magnetic field, etc. And they propagate, when they calculated these backwards and calculated what the value of C is, it turned out to be 299,799,000 meters per second. And they looked at that and they said, that's the speed of light. So the physicists said, by golly, now we know what light is. It turns out, as a matter of fact, this is no extra charge for this little fact, but it turns out that the calculated speed of light was more accurate than their measured speed of light at that time. When they got better measurements, it was closer to this calculated value than it was to what they had previously thought the measured value was. I wish I knew differential equations, but I don't. But
Don't look at me.
Anyway, they decided, well, this must be a description of light. But the catch is that light only covers what a musician would call one octave, and what a ham calls one harmonic. Red light has twice the wavelength of violet light, almost exactly, not quite exactly, but very close to twice the wavelength of violet light. Or to put it another way, violet light has about twice the frequency of red light. And then they began to learn that there were light you couldn't see outside these limits, infrared and ultraviolet light, and they realized that that's probably the same thing. And so a German physicist named Heinrich Hertz began to, several people experimented with it, but Hertz is the one that came up with the real solution to making longer wavelength electromagnetic waves. Next one is, I believe, ham O3. I'm sorry I didn't put these on PowerPoint or something, but Hertz made this machine, and this is a diagram of the very first human-made transmitter and receiver that ever worked. Now, obviously, there are a lot of things in nature, like galaxies and such, that transmit radio waves. But this is the first one ever made by a human being, and it's very simple. They had to use DC. They hadn't come up with generators in the 1870s or 80s quite. So they used batteries. And they had this vibrator arrangement here that turns the power on and off at a very rapid rate. And you see the transformer here that raises the voltage to a very, of course the transformer won't raise DC voltage, but that interrupted voltage changes just like AC does. It's a square wave actually, like that. Instead of a sine wave, it's a square wave. And so that generates a very high voltage on these two electrodes and throws a spark across here. Well, Hertz put a loop on the other side of the room And when he got a spark here, he got a spark here. And so he figured out that he was sending electromagnetic waves across the moon. Now, let's look at, I believe it's round 5. It's the next one, whatever that sequence is. And this is what Hertz had to say about his discovery. Whoops, that's the wrong one.
The
4. I don't think there is a 4. There it is. This is what Hertz had to say about his discovery. I put that up there because there had been times when I was fooling around with that transmitters and antennas that I thought he was probably right. But anyway, Hertz made the first transmitter and receiver. Now they improved on the receivers. They got things like what's called a decoherent, and I won't even try to describe that. And then they got crystal detectors to pick up the signals, and that was much more sensitive than that round loop with the spark gap. You all maybe have played with crystal radios when you were young. And then Marconi was an engineer. He was an Anglo-Italian engineer. His mother was English and his father was Italian, so he spoke beautiful Queen's English, but lived in it and really spoke beautiful Italian. He didn't work in it. But he said, you know how engineers are, he said, if Hertz can send a signal across the room, I can send one across the ocean. It took him about 3 years of work before he did. But he was able to build a transmitter up in northern Scandinavia. And it's still in existence, by the way.
Really?
A spark transmitter that would transmit across the way to Newfoundland. That's about the narrowest part of the Atlantic Ocean, I think. And so he was able to start sending Morse code messages across the ocean, which meant also where there were ships. Now Marconi patented this, and he held a patent on it, so he was the only one that could make these things for a while. And that's why if you saw the movie Titanic, you saw the radio operator had an M on his cap, because he worked for the Marconi company. Marconi, nobody could do this but Marconi. Now hams could, because they weren't doing it commercially and you couldn't catch them. But as you can imagine, with two problems with this thing. Number one, they weren't tuned. That spark gap was hard to tune. So you transmitted a signal all over the spectrum when you transmitted a signal. And not only that, even when they learned to build tuned circuits and narrow it down, they would transmit what amounted to a carrier with sidebands that went all the way back. So that didn't help a whole lot. And so they got to be pretty much chaos. And first, the experimenters that did this, by the way, in Italy and a lot of the countries, they're not called amateurs, they're called experimentadores, which is, and Marconi always considered himself an experimenter, even though he made a lot of money off this stuff. So he considered himself an amateur. But he came up with ways of getting the signal across. You know, tens of thousands of watts across a wide gap made a signal strong enough to go across the ocean. In those days, they thought the longer the frequency, the farther it would go. The longer the wavelength, the farther it would go. And there's some truth to that, because long wavelengths would follow the curve of the Earth around and would even penetrate the oceans, and Navy, I think, still uses them to communicate with submarines. So along about 1912, the U.S. government decided that there's got to be some regulation, and we've got to make some traffic rules. So they made the rule that hams, amateurs, would have to be on 200 meters and down, they call it, 200 meters of wavelength and shorter. We would have said 200 meters and higher because we think frequency, but 200 meters and shorter wavelengths because they thought they were worthless. That starts at about 1,500 kilocycles, and they were kilocycles in those days. They hadn't been named for Hertz yet. Some of y'all may remember that. It was certainly kilocycles when I started that. And these guys discovered that, you know, 80 meters, 40 meters, 20 meters. Really pretty useful. They knew about the ionosphere, but they didn't know that it would reflect these waves back down. And the Hams were the people that discovered that. And of course, as soon as we did, they started taking short waves away from us and putting us on narrow bands. Now, along about 1920, there had been experiments with transmitting voices as early as 1900, but the equipment was complicated and the quality was not very good, and so didn't get anywhere until about the 1920s, when Lee DeForest invented the triode radio tube. They had developed diode radio tube rectifiers before that, and that made the most sensitive detectors they had. That was most sensitive in crystals up to that point. But then DeForest put a control grid in there and made a real amplifier. And he called it the Audion because he thought it would only amplify audio frequencies, but it turned out you can make them that amplify radio frequencies. And of course that was a big break in both transmitters and receivers. You could transmit a clear signal, what's called a continuous wave, which is pure, as opposed to these damped waves that the spark put out. And so that in itself cut down a lot on the QRM. You could, if you didn't hear, if this frequency is occupied, you tuned unknown. And so in the 1920s, AM phone became very practical. Now, along about that time, there were people writing about something called single sideband suppressed carrier, but the equipment was complicated and expensive and hard to adjust. And also, a guy named Armstrong, I believe it was, invented FM. And FM had the big advantage that it was cheap to make a modifier, but it didn't work well with AM receivers. You could do it, but it didn't work very well. So it didn't get applied in ham radio very much. It came in commercial radio in the 30s and especially the 40s and 50s for commercial broadcasting. And hams were experimenting with it, but not very many and not very effectively. So for all practical purposes, by 1950, 99% of ham radio was either CW or AM phone. And this is where I came in. I first read about ham radio in 49 or 50 when I was in the 6th grade. Boy, that sounded like fun. And I was informed by my parents that was expensive and we couldn't afford it. But I kept dreaming and studying and such like. And the League put out a book back in those days called How to Become a Radio Amateur, and some of y'all may remember this. It had plans for a 1-tube battery-operated receiver, regenerative receiver, and a 1-tube transmitter that wasn't even breadboard. It was built on a wooden frame, made about 15 watts, CW, of course, and I built a receiver. And my mother told me that if I would make it work, she would buy me a real receiver. It took 6 or 8 months. And it turned out what I had done wrong was it had a regeneration coil. And a small coil that fed the signal back into the big computing coil. I had wound the small coil backwards, so it was degenerative rather than regenerative. So finally I realized what I had done, and I fixed it, and it worked. And my mother, bless her heart, bought me a used S40 receiver from Walter Eich Radio, who had a big trade in used receivers, supposedly refurbished. It worked pretty well. I was satisfied with it. And I became a shortwave listener. And I kept listening and listening. And then she told me if I would get a license, she would get me a transmitter.
And how old were you at this time? How old were you?
It was 1953 when I actually got the license. I was 15 years old.
Wow.
Now, meanwhile, when I started out, the only 2 classes of license were what we would call general and advanced. And you had to have the general for a year before you could even take the test for the advanced. The general test was really tough for a seventh grader to be studying. And you had to have 13 word a minute Morse code to get any license at all. Now, 13 words a minute takes an awful lot of practice if you're learning it by practicing. And I got up to around 6 or 8 words a minute with using records and a tape machine that I rented from Mr. Walter Eich. My mother and he got on a first name basis. Then they came out with the novice and technician licenses. The tech license had the same written test as the general. But the novice written test was very simple, and I was already copying 8 words a minute without much trouble. So Daddy took me to Birmingham. If you lived less than 125 miles from an examining place, you had to go take the test. I lived 120 miles from Birmingham and 120 miles from Atlanta.
Oh, yeah.
So I had to go to Birmingham. We had family there we could stay with. And I took the 5 word a minute code test, and I think I had 90%, maybe 100% on it. And I took the novice written test, and I knew I had aced it. And I thought, you know, it doesn't cost anything. I'm going to go ahead and take the general technician class written test. I just want to look at it. I'll never pass it. I hadn't studied for it. I knew I'd never in a million years pass it without intensive study. But I thought, it doesn't cost anything, I'll do it. About 2 months later, my license came in, and I was licensed with a novice license WN4AZA, and I meant to bring the QSL card, but I forgot it, and a technician license W4AZA. I had passed the thing. I probably made a 77 or a 78, but I passed it. Now, I never operated on my technician license because that would have meant buying VHF stuff, and I was lucky to get high frequency stuff. Besides, it wasn't a ham within 50 miles that used VHF. And 120 miles was the world record for 2 meters back in those days. And I think something like 15 or 20 miles on 70 centimeters. So I never used a technician license, but they gave me credit for the general class written test, and all I had to take was the Morse code test. Well, Daddy took me to Atlanta in spring break, and I took the code test, and the engineer said, I have scored this 5 or 6 ways, and every way you're 1 letter short. So I didn't pass it. So I kept working on it, and bless goodness, the FCC decided if you live more than 75 miles from a testing place, you can take the exam from a volunteer examiner. For the written test, it had to be 2 adults. But for the code test, any licensed ham, general class or higher, could give you the code test. Well, I knew a couple of hams in my area, not very well, but the one I knew best was 3 years older than me and was in the band with me. And so he came over to the house and he said, I had, practice oscillator. He said, we're just going to practice for a while. Just copy what I'm sending you. And he sent me some stuff out of QST for about 5 minutes. And he says, let me see what you got. He looked at it and he said, okay, you passed. I said, now let's try it at 13 words a minute. He said, that was 13 words a minute. So about a month later, my general class license came in. Now my transmitter, let's have the next one, which they may, we skipped one there. It's 05, I believe.
That's 05.
Or if that's 06, 05, and then it was 04.
Let's see if we got a 4. There's not a 4.
There's not a 4, and there's not a 10.
Well, there's 2 5s.
Are there? Okay. Well, I may have messed up. There we go.
Okay.
Now that is not exactly the transmitter that I got. My mother bought me a $30 kit for a transmitter.
Big money back there.
Now that is the Amico AT1. I cannot find it online, but I had an Amico transmitter, but it was not this one. And in some ways it was much more sophisticated, and in some ways it was much less sophisticated. It had a little light bulb here on the front. You know, in those days you had to tune your final amplifier. And that took care of matching the impedance for the most part. They had what it was called a pi network final amplifier, and that would match most any impedance. But you had to tune your final amplifier to that. You tuned for a dip, and then you loaded it a little bit and re-dipped it and took a little tuning. But these are the tuning and the, I guess, loading controls, capacitors. Mine had a little pilot light right here in the middle, and you didn't tune it by meter, you tuned it to that pilot light. But now mine was different in that this one is a 15-watt one, and mine was rated for 25 watts. And this one has the power supply on the main chassis. Mine had a separate chassis for the power supply and had two tubes on the main chassis, two receiving type tubes, a 6V6 and a 6L6. And mine put out 25 watts. It was essentially a breadboard. This one is sophisticated and has a closed chassis. But mine was a U-shaped chassis, and if you stuck your fingers under those open ends, you'd get a 470 volt shock. My fingers behaved themselves, and I had a lot of fun with that rig. I tuned it first just to a random length wire. Like I said, Pi Network will tune most anything. It was about 30 feet long, and then I got Daddy to put up a telephone pole about 130 feet away, which is about a half wavelength on 80 meters. We had privileges on the novice thing on a slice of the 80 meter band, a slice of the 40 meter band, and a slice of the 15 meter band. Earlier on, we had 80 meters and 11 meters, but they took 11 meters away from us to give to the C-Beers and gave us 15 meters, and that was a great swap. But when I first got in, 15 meters was not a hand band. And then they released it and gave the novices a little slice of 15 meters. I had to wind my own coil for that. The instructions didn't come with it, but I managed to wind the 15. Of course, to change bands, you changed coils. It had plug-in coils, of which there is an example. So I got so that I could work on 80, 40, and 15 meters. Well, now I could operate. You could get, kilowatt if I could afford it, which I couldn't, and I could operate on any of the licensed handbands. I had a general class license. In those days, general could operate all CW bands, but could not operate on 80 or 20 meter phone bands, and nobody could operate on 40 meters on phone. It was a pure CW band. Then the FCC changed the rules and let general class operators have pretty much full privileges. But meanwhile, this little rig wouldn't work anything but 80, 40, and 15. So my mother came, bless her heart, she bought junk and sold antiques. She refinished and reupholstered it, and she made dresses. She made my date's dress for the prom when I was a senior, and I called my girlfriend to ask her what color the dress was, and she was so excited because I hadn't seen it. And of course, it was hanging there on the door. I just hadn't seen it. That's another story. Anyway, from her sewing and antique money, she would buy antiques from Pennsylvania, and they would come in with 4 or 5 coats of wagon paint on them, white and green wagon paint.
My mother did the same thing.
Yeah, she would strip them down and refinish them. My grandmother had a cabinet in the kitchen, china cabinet, that was painted white enamel. When grandmother and granddaddy died, nobody wanted it. So my mother took it home and stripped it down and refinished it. It was beautiful oak, and everybody wanted it, and she said, you can't afford it. I've still got it. Anyway, she bought me the parts from Allied Radio to make a 75-watt transmitter. It was, and of course, y'all know that in those days you had a transmitter and a receiver. You didn't usually have transceivers, except some of the VHF things you could get. The Gonsick made a transceiver for 2 meters. So I had my good receiver. And I bought the parts, and following the schematic and the pictures from the handbook, I built the transmitter. It cost me $75. You could build a transmitter for about $1 a watt back in those days. And, but if you wanted to do AM, you had to build a modulator, which cost another $1 a watt. So I had to stay on CW. But I built a transmitter, and I wish I had a picture of it to show you. But it was a big black box, and it worked. It still had interchangeable coils, but it used a 6146 final amplifier tube and ran 75 watts. But now remember, we rated them by input in those days. The output, they rate everything by output now, and then, so that would really be probably about 35 watts output. But I worked all over the U.S. I worked about 40 states. I never got work off space. A lot of my friends did, but I guess I was busy doing a lot of other stuff too. I worked about 40 states and 5 or 6 countries, all in Central or South America. My best DX was Chile. By the way, using my old rig like this, I worked in the Lake Grove, Oregon, on about 25 watts. And I thought that was pretty good. But on the one that replaced this, I ran 75 watts and worked a bunch of stuff. Now, in my sophomore year of college, by the way, I graduated from high school in 1956. What was the date of the highest sunspot count ever? 1957 and 1958. So I got into radio at just the right time. I mean, 10 meters was wide open everywhere. So anyway, I built this all-band transmitter, 75 watts. But it didn't work for me. My sophomore year of college, I got my first paying job. I was appointed as a Methodist minister of 4 little country churches, and that's the first job I ever got paid for. I had worked at scout camp in previous years, but there this pay was just you get to be at camp. I got $150 a month. Nowadays, when I fill in at a church, they pay me $150 for service. But I had 4 churches. I went to 2 every Sunday. I loved it. It was great. But I realized that I just had to go on with science. That was my gift from God. So I went to medical school instead of seminary. Decided that the first week of my senior year of college. But during my college years, I operated a lot, and with that $150 a month, I bought the next one. I don't know what the next picture of is, but that's it. I bought a Globe Scout. This was a nice little all-band rig. Now, it was still crystal control. Some of y'all may remember crystal control. You had to buy a different crystal for every frequency, and it cost about $12 to $15, which was a lot of money for me in those days. Remember, you could buy a Hershey bar or a Coke for a nickel and mail a letter for 3 cents back in those days. So $15 was a lot of money. I had 2 or 3 crystals. The Globe Scout was a phone rig, and they could make it cheaper because they didn't modify the plate of the final amplifier tube, which would have taken 75, well, actually I guess 35 watts. They modulated the screen, which takes about 15 watts. And the audio quality is not quite as good, but most people can tell the difference. And so I had a really relatively inexpensive phone rig, and boy, did I have fun. I'm going to next picture, whatever that number is. There's another picture of Globe Scout. These were not mine. Not Globe Scouts. I pulled them off the web. But another Globe Scout, and still got the crystal thing there. By the way, it was band switch. I didn't have to change coils to change bands. And I bought a piece of kit VFO at the center. And a friend had a couple of 80-meter crystals that I could use to calibrate it with. And there was a little wire coming from it down to the crystal socket. I think there may have been another crystal socket on the back that I could plug into. But anyway, and then I had a VFO. I could tune to any frequency without having to buy new crystals. Boy, that was fun. I had more fun with this rig than, actually, I probably had more fun with that first one than any one I ever had. But I had a lot of fun with this one on both AM and CW. Got my code speed up to 20 word minute code proficiency.
Ooh.
And just, it was great. The problem was I graduated from college and went to medical school. I didn't have room in the fraternity house to set up a rig. I couldn't put up a decent antenna on a small lot in New Orleans. I didn't have time to do anything but study anyway. And you know, in medical school, you go to school and then you go home and study and then you go back to school. We had Wednesday afternoons and Saturday afternoons and all day Sunday off. But I was recuperating rather than doing handling stuff during that time. And I have never been a very active ham since that time. But when I finished my medical school, I moved to Birmingham for my internship. And I got this rig all set up in the house we rented, and I had some fun with it that year. Plus, I was making a little more money then. And even though I had a wife and a kid, I worked in the emergency room out extra enough to get the next picture up, whatever that is. And you'll recognize this, I'm sure some of you may have had one like this. A Heathkit SB, this is the 300 receiver. I bought the 400 transmitter and just kept trying to use my old receiver, and it did work, but it wasn't good. Several years later, I was able to buy the SB 300 receiver. And they would transceive, actually. You could hook them up so that they all worked off the transmitter DFO. And, but you know, for some reason, I never used this rig a lot. Three reasons were named Ginger, Paul, Mark, and Donna. And they claimed a certain amount of my time after all. And then part of that time I was in the Navy and was a resident. Medical residents don't have time to think about radio. That's worse than medical school. But I had to renew my license while I was a resident. And to renew your license, you had to put in a couple of hours of operating time. So I didn't want to let the thing lapse. By the way, in between this time, I was in Hawaii for 2 years. And instead of W4AZA, I was KH6FSY. And I wasn't on the air but about 3 times during that 2 years. But I got back to Virginia and got my W4 call back. And I've had it ever since. I've had it for 67 years, except for those 2 years in Hawaii. Anyway, I didn't have room to set up this rig and the receiver, and I didn't have time to fool with it much. So next picture is the last one. I bought a Heathkit Tour. It was about the size of a kid's lunchbox. In fact, they were called Benton Harbor lunchboxes. It was a 2-meter AM transceiver. Crystal control. You could tune, the receiver tuned all over the band, but it was crystal control for the transmitter, and I think you had a choice if you could plug in 2 crystals and switch between them. A ham there in Norfolk built me a beam antenna, and I put it up on the roof. I had a railing around the front porch, and I clamped it to the railing. And I used this enough to renew my license, and then put it aside and never used it again. But I had a lot of fun with it. I did use it some. I used it a lot there in Norfolk, just talking to other hams in my spare time. But considering that I didn't have any spare time much, I was on call every 3rd night except when somebody was on vacation, when I was on call every other night. And I was usually in bed by 2 o'clock on my nights on call. One night I got 15 minutes of sleep like this at the desk. But usually I was in bed by 2 o'clock, but I worked all day the next day from 7 to 6:30, really till 5 or 6. So I wasn't too interested in ham radio. And what spare time I did have, I spent with my kids. By that time I had 2. And, you know, we flew kites and stuff like that. Really, you know, they grow up and ham radio will still be there. y'all have all experienced that, I know. But anyway, that let me keep my license. I was in Jacksonville, Florida for a couple of years and never got it really set up. Then I moved to Florence and got it set up. I knew a few hams, met a few hams here in Florence. Ralph Penman, I don't know if any of y'all ever knew Ralph, but his wife and Junior were real good friends, and he was sort of, we elmoed each other actually. He got his license after I came here, but he was an engineer and he actually understood it a lot better than I did, so we worked together. Ralph was a good friend, and I did a little work, you know, every month or two I'd get on the station. And then in 1990, I had bought a 2-meter handheld for Ted Pounders. He handled that sort of thing for a little while in his hardware store. And I bought that and I would call in on the net, such as that. I built an antenna, a vertical, in-fed, 4-element in-fed antenna. Put it outside the window, and I was able to work into the net indicator, and I might have gotten into the hospital if I tried with that, using my little handheld. But mostly I just checked in on the road here, and so every now and then we get on and have a grad sheet. 1990, we moved out on the lake. I never set the rig up. I gave my rig to a missionary. And from 1990 until about 5 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, I was completely off the air. I couldn't use the handheld because I lived down on Donegan Slough, down in the bottom of the canyon, sort of, and I couldn't get out there. I might have been able to hook up my 4-element antenna, vertical antenna, but I never got around to it. So for about 15 years, I was off the air. Then we moved back to town, and a few years ago I was commuting to Wisconsin to take theology classes. Along the way I had been ordained not a Methodist but an Episcopal priest, but I still made my living practicing medicine. And I was driving up to take some theology classes, and we passed an antenna, and I admired the antenna. And Ginger said, I want you to get a rig and get back on the air. Well, what are you going to do? You got to keep the X by L happy. So I did, and I first got a Yaesu FT991, and I liked it, and it worked fine. And it worked both high frequencies and VHF. So I could, get on the net with that same rig and everything. The problem was, I couldn't have a decent antenna where I was. And I couldn't find an automatic antenna tuner that would work with the FT991. And Yaesu didn't know of one either, which points the problem up. So I bought an FT1200. Fine rig, big, really nice rig. And I got on the air with it and had a lot of fun. I had to use it for high frequency on my 991 for VHF when I checked into the net. But I had fun with it. I don't operate often, but I get on a little bit. And then they came out with another automatic antenna tuner that would work with the FT991. So I took my FT1200 down because I needed the desk space. The 991 is much bigger than this, Mm-hmm. And I've been having fun with it. I made one night on the web, put that FT1200 up for sale. It's a real nice rig, but I'm having plenty of fun with the smaller rig, and I need the space. It'll do everything I want to do. So, there are 2 good books on the history of ham radio. One of them you probably know about. It's an ARRL book, 200 meters and down. It's the definitive history, but it reads like a history book. I mean, it's very accurate and precise. If you want to know the story of ham radio precisely and historically, that's the book to get. The other one I accidentally came up with online, and I got it and read it, and I looked and looked and looked for it to bring over here, and finally decided, I'm not gonna find it. I'm gonna order another one from Amazon. So I went on Amazon and bought it, tried to buy it, and they said, you already got one on Kindle, which is why I couldn't find it. But this is the name of the book. And it is a very readable book about ham radio from 1901 to 1930 or thereabouts. It's pretty much told the way I've told the story tonight. So it's very readable and enjoyable book. Tells a lot about his personal life and his trials and tribulations. I said on the There we go. I really enjoyed that book. I meant to reread it, but like I said, I couldn't find it until last night. Well, the night before last, when they told me I already had it on Kindle.
On your search page, you had a PDF file that's downloadable.
No, I can't. The World of Ham Radio, 1901 to 1950, by Richard A. Bartlett, A Social History.
Down .pdf that
The world of,
popped up.
oh, the world, okay.
So that's the story. I figured it out. They started licensing hams in 1912. That's 109 years ago.
Wow.
I was licensed 67 years ago and have been licensed. Even though I was out of radio, I kind of kept up with it. So I've been licensed 67 years. That's 62% of the time that they've been licensing hams I've been licensed for. So I have seen a good bit of change. I've seen, you know, I remember when they brought out the first slow scan thing and they were calling it facsimile. But then they realized it really isn't facsimile, it's television. It's just slideshows instead of movies. And then I remember in the early 1970s, slow scan was really hot. Everybody was doing, you know, slideshows with slow scan. Then I remember when a bunch of, this was a little earlier even, when a bunch of surplus taxi cab radios and public service radios came on the market. And hams bought them up, and that was what really opened up 2 meters and the repeater system. I read somewhere, I can't swear to this, but I read somewhere that the ham radio repeater system was the foundation on which cell phones were built. That we pioneered that, and then they took it and polished it a little bit and made the cell phone system.
And the same with Wi-Fi that we use everywhere.
Wow.
So computers have opened up a lot of advantages, a lot of digital modes. And it's been exciting. It's been a lot of fun, even though I haven't been as active as I would have liked to be. End of lecture. Any questions?
No, but I wish we'd had you when we went to Eric, what was that guy's name?
The one on Brush Creek Road?
Yes. He had, there was a gentleman who passed away and his house up in St. Florine. He had all this old radio equipment.
Oh, boy.
And half of us were there, and if I'd, you know, thought about it, I would have called you and said, Dr. Eich, come on over. It was just down the street from you. I mean, sort of.
Bunch of old military stuff.
A lot, but you would have.
From all different countries, Czechoslovakia, and I mean, just all everywhere stuff.
But he had all this old, I mean, old radio equipment. You would have had a field day with it and just kind of went, oh, this is that, and we.
I wish I had saved both my Globe Scout and that rig that I built from scratch. I cannibalized the Amico rig that I had. I used that power supply for something else, and then I used some of the other parts out there.
That is cool.
But I wish I had that old homebrew rig I built and the Globe Scout. I got rid of them after we moved here. After my parents moved up there, I guess.
But that's awesome that your mom said, you do this, and you did it?
Yeah.
Wow.
I was an only child, and I was really spoiled. But my daddy was a farmer, and we didn't have a lot of money to spoil me with. He and Granddaddy farmed together. I realized one day Daddy was a sharecropper. He and Granddaddy owned the land and provided the capital, and Daddy managed the farm, and they shared the income. So he was a sharecropper, But sharecropping 1,200 acres is a little different from sharecropping 40 acres. So we were not quite on the same economic level as a lot of sharecroppers, but it wasn't a favorable situation for Dave. But we got along, we had everything we needed, and a little extra. And they were able to put me through an expensive college. I had a scholarship to medical school, so that didn't cost me much in medical school. But anyway, golly, I've had fun in my life.
Yes, you have. That is awesome though, but I mean, just the history of ham radio now. I'm gonna have to take some of this notes if we ever have to teach a class again. I may just say, let's have Dr. Eich do this. I would look, would you be free next April? We're planning on doing a collaboratory, open house. I've already got the collaboratory booked. It's either the 9th or the 16th. I picked both dates, so we're there.
I say that, I'm 83 and I can't promise I'll be alive next April.
Well, I think you will, but I'm gonna put you down as, this is cool. I mean, just looking at some of that equipment, the fact that some of it, I could, some of the buttons and all that, okay. I know what this means. But the thought of having to have all those crystals, and plugging one out, swapping it in, and you had to...
You have to tune the founder again. The other thing,
Were they
when you finish your transmission, you have to turn the transmitter off and turn the receiver on and switch the antenna over from the transmitter to the receiver.
Unless you're Dow Q relay.
every time?
Unless you're one of Q relays.
Yeah.
Every time.
There are ways around that, but I couldn't afford them. So we had a desk that they gave to me, and later on, for a birthday present, they had somebody build me a real nice operating desk.
How big was the crystal?
That's your tune circuit that gives you the frequency.
But how big was it? I mean, it's just...
What size your thumbnail?
Novices had to use crystal control. Now nothing uses crystal.
Yeah, I've got a couple at the house, I'll bring them in.
Were they... Okay, you swapped out crystals depending on what frequency.
Yeah.
Were
They
they...
were a little like a SD card, except bigger and thicker, or a little like a thumb drive, except smaller.
But were they color coded so you knew, or how did you know?
They usually had the frequency printed, etched on the side of the case. Now, you didn't really see the crystals. Somebody gave me some surplus crystals once, and I took one apart to see what they looked
What
like.
about this size?
They're bigger. They're more about the size of a postage stamp.
Okay.
You know.
This is the dongle that goes
Yeah,
with the
that's-
USB.
Wow.
When I got on, I met two guys, when I took the novice exam, I met two guys, and we got to be friends and got each other's addresses and everything. And they told me they were operating on 3711. Well, I had bought a 3734 crystal, 3.734 mega cycles they were in those days. So it was, occasionally we were able to get together, me working on, up here and them working down there. But I ordered another one from them, from Allied Radio. I said, I want the closest you can give me to 3711 that's still in the 80 meter novice speed. So they gave me 3712. So I had two crystals, 3712 and 3734. And, if one of those was clear, I could operate on it. If it wasn't clear, I just had to wait till they were.
Wow.
And then I got a 40 meter crystal after they, opened up 40 meters to us. And by the time I was really able to operate 15 meters, I think I had the VFO. But novices are not allowed to use the VFO. And the novice license was only good for 1 year and could not be renewed when it first came out. So you had to get your code speed up in that year or else.
Wow. Wow. But that's awesome. It's just, wow. Things you never knew. Well, things I didn't know anyway.
I've got a little radio to you at home. I was teaching the radio merit badge to a bunch of scouts, and I kept mentioning radio to use, and one of them says, "It's a radio to you." So I found a small one,
Mm-hmm.
but I couldn't find it to bring over here. I know y'all have seen one anyway, but the scouts had never seen one. And, it was a new idea for them. And, every rig I had was used up until I got the part of the SB 400 was solid state, and then of course the new YESO rigs out of all solid state.
I think it's just the concept of having to swap out and then turn it off, turn this on, and then turn the other one off, and then turn the other one back on to go back and forth.
I got pretty quick at it.
Yeah, and just,
When you're using CW, you don't absolutely have to turn the transmitter off, because it's not transmitting if you're not pressing the key. So all I had to really remember to do was to turn the receiver back on from standby and throw the antenna from transmit to receiver.
wow. I mean, I'm just looking at all the different buttons. And just, of course,
This one had a little, this little control here went from transmit to receive. You just pressed on that.
that is a cool thing.
This tuned the receiver. That was the pilot light, and that told you when you were transmitting. And the crystal was, there was a crystal socket at the back that would hold two crystals, if I remember correctly. I sold mine not long ago on eBay for $45, exactly what it had cost me. I was 54.
What a good return on your money.
It had, and I think it was still in operating condition. I could still get the rush when I turned the receiver on, and it was a super regenerative receiver, and they have a high noise level, but they're very sensitive, so they have to put a high noise level.
Here's your, I've got a old Whiteface Johnson CB radio. It's got the plug-in crystal.
Oh, wow. That's just the thought of,
I've got a handy talkie about this big that you have to plug the crystals in, a Radio Shack.
Back in those days, the amateur radio handbook had instructions on how to ground a crystal. You could ground your own crystals. And I never tried that. It sounded like a lot of work to me.
You can also grind your own lenses for telescopes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
wow.
That's a lot of work.
Thank you, sir. I'm going to turn off the recording, but
Yeah, go ahead.
thank
Well, I
you.
hope y'all have enjoyed this as much as I have.
I did. It was just